Hello, world, and welcome to part four of creating a podcast monitoring app. So, last time we finished off doing the prototyping for the RSS feed, reading code. So, we worked on some of the XML stuff and kind of played around and figured out the exact way to use the element tree to kind of go through what we had, and we were able to find the title, description, publishing date, the URL to the actual MP3, as well as the duration of the podcast. So now we've completed the prototyping phase of this, and we can move on to the next deliverable that we have, which is to create the RSS feed reader class. And so have here kind of two keywords, the tracer and TDD. TDD stands for test driven development. And so it's essentially, as opposed to creating this class and then going back and writing tests for it, you write the tests, have the tests fail essentially, and then write the code that makes the test pass. The reason for this a lot of times is that it kind of supposed to give us a much better kind of design for things. The tracer portion of this, so a tracer is short essentially for a tracer bullet. And so the idea is that as opposed to just kind of creating, all this code that does all these things, just creating a through line from the start to end of what I want to do. And then after that is completed and working end to end, going and adding new features that we need kind of on the side of it, right? So that's what we're going to work with today. So let's get started. As far as the design goes, I'm going to kind of steal an idea from a book called The Pragmatic Programmer, where we want, when we're coming up with these classes, we want to have them be loosely coupled because we don't necessarily know the changes that we're going to make in the future. So not kind of coupling all these things together will give us more freedom down the line to do stuff. Now, being loosely coupled is kind of a very broad way of describing something. So one thing that I like when they kind of describe it is the idea of writing shy code. Writing code that doesn't necessarily need to know a lot about other code. So that way, if a change has to be made, it's not propagated through all the issues that it doesn't cause issues as it kind of propagates through, and you have to kind of go and make changes. So as far as the RSS feed reader class, we have three things that it basically needs to do, and it's based off of these three prototypes. We need it to read in the JSON file. We need to make a web request based off of the URL that's in that JSON file, and then we need to kind of read the XML. And so we could have kind of a class for all of these different things. We could, come up with kind of this this more rigid architecture. But at least to start with, I kind of want to keep things as simple as possible and keep it lightweight. So for these three different things that we need to do, I'm not going to do anything special for the web request. I don't think there's really a need for it, since essentially this is the entire thing for the web request, and then the actual portion of getting the URL, or the portion of from the JSON, or the portion of manipulating the content from the XML, those can actually do work. This here is obviously very, very simple, and I think can just throw it into a function. For the JSON reader portion of it, I'm thinking that there are kind of two approaches, right? So I could read in the JSON into, read it in using what we did up here, and then taking these things and kind of making them class elements, and then kind of accessing them through so saving all these things in members of a class and then accessing them through methods and then doing any kind of manipulation or validation on that stuff. That is, it's not a bad idea, but what I'm thinking is I want to keep it lightweight for now. And the fact is, because this content is in JSON and is essentially, once we read it in, is structured inside a Python dictionary, as long as we validate that that dictionary is kind of proper, formatted, has the right contents and data inside of it, then there's not really a need to start kind of writing all this almost like boilerplate class code to kind of knock stuff out. So I'm thinking for that, we might just create a kind of a lightweight class structure, almost like if you're familiar with other languages like C or like what have you, when you have a struct, just kind of a something that is going to hold the data, and then we'll probably add into it a validation. So we can kind of construct that, and then I think the bulk of it, and so I don't think the bulk of the actual class, if that's what we're doing these things, the bulk of the actual class is going to be an XML reader. So that I don't think we, again, need to create another class and then leverage it necessarily. We could, but if that becomes the case that feels necessary, I'll abstract it out. So I'll just start with that in the class. So we're going to have one main class, have a data class for the JSON stuff that then can be used, and then probably create another data class to store the episode information. And then we'll see if that ends up turning into, and that'll be what we kind of manipulate. And then we'll see business logic wise what we're kind of going to do going forward. So first thing, since we're doing the test driven development, I'm going to create a test file to start with. Now, there's kind of two ways I could go about doing this. I could create a folder that holds all the test files, or I could create the test file and just have it live right next to the file that I'm using. Structurally, it's a little easier to just put the file next to it because you don't have to worry about the imports and stuff. But if you end up with a ton of test files and all these different things, it can be nice to put like tests and resources and all that stuff within its own directory and then just import stuff. And that's definitely doable. But for now, at least, I'm going to start again simply and then put the test file in here. So so we're working on this RSS feed reader. And so for that, I'm just going to create RSS feed reader unit test.py. And then from here, basically, I'm going to import. I'm going to create just the skeleton of it to start with. So unit test. And then I'm just going to say class RSS feed reader test, and this is going to go off of, I'm kind of copying just some boilerplate that I have from other ones. That's why I'm like glancing this way. So this is going to be, this test suite, which they call test case in this, is going to be the start of what we kind of hold on our tests. And so in here, there are two methods that are kind of built in that are very useful depending on what we end up doing. And that's the setup. And let me just make sure the caps are good, yeah. And teardown. And you see if I kind of auto-complete it, it adds this, but for now I'm not going to worry about any of this stuff. And I'm just going to put them here as kind of placeholders. The point of the setup method is that it runs before every test, and the teardown it runs after every test. So I can't guarantee the order of the tests that I run. So if I have multiple tests, I can't necessarily guarantee the order that they're going to run. But if I create the data in setup, I can know that the different tests are going to be run on different things that are in setup. So let's say I'm setting up a piece of data. I can do it in setup, and then I can kind of have different things that I'm testing about it in these tests, and they're going to be operating on unique pieces of them. So I'm just going to go. I'm going to create a first test, just a hello world. Now, one thing to note about the hello world or the this test here is in the unit test framework. I need to start it with test so that it kind of gets run as this. If I start with anything else, it won't necessarily know it's a test. So I can always just create other methods that do helper things, but only the things that start with test are going to end up running. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add this here and unit test. And this will mean that basically if I run this file, it will run the test suite that I have here. So let's open up, or let's start the virtual environment. And now let's just run this test so that we can kind of see the test passing, or existing, I guess. So I'm just going to type Python, run that, and you see one test was ran, and that's actually what this dot is here. It's indicating that test was running. Now, if you'll note, as I was saying, if I put something else here, right? So let's say I want to just comment out that test. I don't need to comment out the test. I can just put that there, and now it doesn't run. So now 0 tests ran. And I can do anything here. Obviously, I can just say print hello world. Or I can even do like some sort of assert. So there's I don't need to use this regular assert. I can actually, there's a built-in assert. So the self is the class. The self is a reference to this class, and since the class is a subclass of the test case, it has all these built-in methods. So for example, I can assert equal, I can assert true or false, I can assert in for like a list. So like I can just do assert true, and I run it and it passes. If I go up and say false, run it and now see it failed. Assert false is not true. Gives me the line. All those nice things. So this is the basic kind of framework for this. One other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of leverage Git here, so that way I can commit things. So if you look at our commit log here, right? So what do I have? I have initialization of the repo, create feeds.json, filled in the RSS data, added in kind of information, the work tracker, and then the various prototypes. So now I could just keep committing things, right? But if I want to commit often, as I should, what I'm going to end up having is I'm going to have a ton of commits that are kind of related to this. And I might not want that. I might want kind of a simpler set of commits. And I could manipulate it in here afterwards, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate branch where I'm kind of working on this code. So what I'm going to do is git checkout -b, which will create a new branch, and I'm going to call it. Normally, I would prefix things with kind of like a username, but in this case, since I'm the only one working on it, I'm just going to name it very simply. So I'm just going to say RSS feed reader tracer. And now if I type git branch, you'll see that I now have these two branches, RSS feed read tracer and main, and I'm currently on the RSS feed tracer. If I look back at the log again, you'll see that the head is pointing to the RSS feed read tracer, and then I also have this main here. Now if I make a commit, so I have the RSS feed unit test. Oh, and the other reason is because I might commit things that are broken. So for example, right now, this actually passes. But if I start adding a test, it's going to be broken. And maybe I want to commit it because I've added a test I want, but it's broken. And I don't necessarily, I kind of want to keep the commits in the main branch as unbroken as possible. So working in this kind of test branch, or this feature branch, allows me to kind of do that more easily. So I'm going to add the RSS feed reader, and I'm going to commit it, and added UT skeleton. And again, I can kind of make this simple. I don't need to reference what I'm doing because I'm already on this branch, and I'm going to end up cleaning it up before I merge it all back in. So, plus, let's say I want to go work on something else. This is maybe, before I actually add this back in, I can always switch back to the other branch. So that's something that makes Git super great to work with. So now if I look at the log here, what you'll see is that main is still on this commit, but now I have another commit here, which is where I added this skeleton. And if I actually come over and I go git checkout main, what you'll see is this file gets removed, right? So the file is now deleted, no longer in here, and this contents is gone. But if I come back and I check out this branch, I now get the file back. So just kind of a quick basics on that there. So first thing we want to do, we're going to want to import, or let's go from RSS feed reader. And I'm going to just go through this like step by step. So RSS feed reader. So this is going to obviously fail because there is no RSS feed reader file that I can import the RSS feed reader class. So if I run this, see, no module named RSS feed reader. So now, test-driven development, right? I made changes to the test because what is the next thing I need to do? I need to import this class so that I can test it. Okay, well the class doesn't exist. So now the module doesn't exist. So now I need to create RSS feed reader.py and save that. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to split these and work them side by side. So now if I run it again, cannot import name RSS feed reader from RSS feed reader. Why? Because it doesn't exist. So let's make it exist. Class RSS feed reader. And pass is just a keyword to basically just mean nothing. So that's why like I add it here. Because if I didn't have it here, it would give me an error because it's not formatted properly. So now if I run it, everything passes. Not doing anything, but everything passes. So we've now created the, and you know, so let's also just commit this to. So okay, so here's the other thing I want to do. So you have this PyCache that's now created because I've been running this Python stuff, and I have this RSS feed reader.cpython, and so this is like a compilation file that I really don't actually care about, and in general, I don't want it to kind of clutter up. If I were to push this to a remote repository, I don't really want that there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in here with the venv and the work tracker, I'm going to add in star PyCache. And so now, anywhere that there's a PyCache that's created, I'm just going to ignore it. So that allows me to kind of like not get cluttered up with all these extra things, since all I really care about is this RSS feed reader in this case. So now if I check out the status, right, I've updated the git ignore to get rid of that, and now the PyCache no longer exists. So I'm going to go git add, git commit, and created empty RSS feed reader class. All right. Now we've done, again, a whole bunch of setup. And so for this last amount of time here, we need to start creating this class, but in a test-driven development fashion. So now we got to kind of have to figure out, like, how do we want to structure this and what do we kind of want to do? And because we're doing test-driven development, we want to do it in the manner of testing functionality. So if we start from the front, which is kind of the JSON reading portion, basically we need to make sure the RSS feed reader class is able to access these URLs, right? So So we have to make sure that, and in this case, we kind of want it to be able to access all this kind of stuff here. And so we, let's see. So let's do test retrieve feed data. So RSS feed reader equals, boom. And we're going to say reader dot URLs. Let's do self dot search. And so because we're kind of structuring it out, there's kind of like tons of things we can kind of check on and stuff. So let's do self.assert. I don't think there's a type. I can do self.assert true, or actually, let's do assert equals. Assert equal. Type URLs is list. And then my second one equal length reader dot URLs is what do we have here? 1, 2, 17. 17. I'm going to remove this one for now. All right. So this is obviously going to fail because there is, oops. Git commit. Did it do anything? Oh, because I didn't add it, so good. So, all right. Back to the run. All right. So it failed because this has no attribute URLs. So this is the basis of test-driven development. I've decided, okay, well, I want it to have URLs. That's a list, and it's going to have 17, which is going to come in from, which is from the data. And so now none of that exists. So basically all I need to do, so it actually kind of makes the coding easier in a sense, because all I have to do is make that pass. So I'm going to create a constructor, which in Python is the init. And right, I can just say self.urls is there. So now I went from having a failing test and I validated. So I now have this. So I have this. I'm going to do this and say, all right, let's see. Nope, see, doesn't work. And so now we have to actually fill this in with data. So now we're actually going to come up and open up this prototype code here. Let me kind of structure these, move the wrong one over. Structure these, going to get rid of this feed. Okay, all right, that works. So basically, we need to use this here. So let's import from JSON, import load. And basically, I mean, so now we have this data in here. And as we kind of saw, like this was, this here is this list where each one is this dictionary. And so I actually only want the URLs in this case. So I want to say self.urls equals a list of, let's go podcast URL for podcast in data. So data here is this list of these dictionaries. So this is so podcast is a dictionary. So just to make that more evident, we can go. So podcast is this dictionary, which contains the URL, the name, and like the type. So we're looping through this, and then for each one, we're grabbing the URL, and then this is called, so this is a list comprehension. And so this is basically just creating a list out of this. So it grabs just every one and adds them into a list. Um, and so I can remove this if I would like, because I'm just resetting it, so it's kind of unnecessary. And now if we run the unit test, it passes. And I'm going to come back over here just to kind of show what we have here. So print reader .urls equal, or print reader.urls. And so now you'll see all the podcasts are now kind of listed here with these elements. And so I can also come in and maybe I want to test like the format for each one. And so I think there's like an all, right? And so return true if true for all variables x in the iterable, right? So I can do self.assert true all, and then return true if bool is true. So do I pass this? I haven't actually used this one. So the iterable object. So I want to pass a function to kind of make this simpler. So I'm going to switch over to this other one and just look at an example online. Alright, my favorite Geeks for Geeks. Yeah, so okay, so it's operating on this actual list itself. Let's see if they have an example with methods. They do not. Function with lambda is what I'm going to end up wanting. Real Python. I feel like that's also not what I want. But let's just check them out real quick. Yeah, it's just giving how lambda functions work. And so let's open up, let's check out this one. Let's see what they got up here. So a lambda function is just kind of like an unnamed function. I'm gonna actually not use a lambda function because I want to make it a little more clear. But I do want to see if they have kind of like a syntax for it. Okay, let's see. So filter takes a condition and an iterable condition, iterable. Okay, so this is, yeah, so this looks like what we kind of want. Okay. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to say, so let's define a function and call it is URL. And that's going to take a URL. And we're going to return return HTTPS in URL. Right, so basically what we're just checking, so what this function basically checks is that if it's given something that's a URL, it's going to verify that HTTPS colon 2 forward slashes is in URL, right? So that it's kind of like formatted like this. It also looks like you could do kind of other checks on these things, but at least for now, we'll just check it like this. And so we'll say all, and so so we're going to do another list comprehension and URL for URL in reader.urls. So basically what we did here is we basically said, okay, similar to here, so we have reader.urls, which is this, right? It's this list of these URLs. So for URL in reader.urls is grab each one of these and then create, similar to how we created this list in the first place, where we went through these dictionaries and we created this this list here. We use this is URL to basically get a true or false value. And so we create we're creating a new list actually that it's either true or false. So if I were to take this and print it out, before I do, I'm gonna just remove this for a second. So if I take this and print it out, what you'll see is I get a list of all true or falses. And so all is doing is saying these are all true, right? So, and then we're using assert true. So all, so I guess I'll do that too. So if I wrap this up in an all, like that, I get a symbol true, right? If one of them didn't have this HTTPS in it, then it would be false. So in this case, it's true. So obviously, if we instead add the assert to it instead of the print, the test is going to pass. So now we essentially have the URLs, but we don't necessarily have the data. And so the question is, like I said, we kind of want to actually create a whole nother class. So let's just start with updating this. So, here we commit added retrieve feed data and RSS feed reader constructor. So I don't want, I could obviously go ahead here. Well, actually, you know what? That's what I'm going to do, because I could create the class, the data class that I'm actually going to store it all in. But because I already have this set up, I'm just going to do it here, and then I'll abstract it out into its own kind of thing. So basically, actually, no, I'm not going to do that because that's going to get confusing. So I'm going to create a data class, which will be feed data. And in here, I'm going to create a class, feed data, and I'm def init self. And so I could here, right, create elements kind of, actually, well, I'm going to delete this. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little all over the place with this today. But I'm actually going to create podcast data. And I'm going to create a class, podcast data. Actually, I need to rename that. Here. Rename. Okay. So I have this podcast data, and I'm going to say def init. And it's going to take a dictionary of podcast. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of it and say self dot data class. I'm just going to set the podcast equals podcast. And I'm going to create a validate method. So essentially, I'm just creating this data class. So I'm giving it the podcast information, which is going to be the dictionary, and then I'm just validating it. And so in this case, we have this name, URL, and type. And so I just want to make sure, for starters, that it essentially has this information here. And so assert name in URL name. And for now, I'm just going to start there, right? I could also check, like I was checking before, is this actually a link? I could also check, is this, this is type. Or I could also check like that this is either main or sub. But for now, I'm just going to do that. So now I have this podcast data, and because it's just kind of it's basically just a wrapper, right? Like it is. So I'm going to have basically a list of these. So when I actually come down into here, I'm going to operate on. It's going to still be the dictionary, but it's wrapped up in the validation. So if I want to, I'm still using just this. I'm not like adding all these different class elements, but I am at least adding a wrapper. So it's kind of a really thin like layer. So if there are changes to the feed data, it's not going to cause major changes because I'm simply using that dictionary as it is. But all I have to do is add validation to it, right? So I don't need to add like, oh, okay. So like, let's add in something else here, right? And then I need to go back in and then add like a member for it and a method for it to access it. Well, no, all I really have to do is add the validation that I want for it. So in this case, I'm going to add this in. Created podcast data. I'm going to call it a struct. Okay, so now we have that, and so when we come back here, so what we're actually going to end up doing, as opposed to just holding onto these URLs, we're going to read this in. So right, we want the data as opposed to the just this URL. So let's kind of make a adjustment here. So we go, so we're actually going to change this to reader dot podcasts, and the type of this is going to be podcast data. And so let's add that as an import. So one thing, I'm going to separate, since this is the thing I'm actually testing, I'm going to keep it down here. And then basically I'm going to have imports that are like basic imports like the JSON or the unit test up here, and then in the middle I'll have imports that I'm using for the test. So podcast data import, podcast data. So reader.podcast is podcast. There still should be 17 of them. And then I could do test the validation that everything's formatted, but the whole reason of having this is that it's actually self-tested kind of in here. So self.validate. So whenever I add it in, basically if I'm creating a podcast data, it's just adding it in and it's doing the validation. So now I can actually remove these. And if I run this, it's going to fail. Because there is no object podcast. So now I have to create this object podcasts. Now, as far as the test goes, right, it's not necessarily validating that the podcast data is correct, but it is validating that it is a podcast type of data. And so, while it's not directly testing this thing, so so I have this data here, right, and then instead of these URLs, I'm just going to comment out for a second because I'm going to use the same sort of format. Right, I'm creating self.podcasts. And actually, okay, so I did get this wrong. So the podcast is going to be a list. And then I also want to validate that all. So I want to use that all again and validate that all of the all of the things in podcasts are of type podcast, right? So similarly as what we did before, we're going to create a list construction, and we're going to say, well, let's create the function first. So def is podcast data. And we're going to give it a podcast. And we're going to say type podcast equals podcast data. All right. And then in here, we're going to say assert true all list construct is podcast data podcast for I'm gonna start calling it pod just to shorten things, for pod in reader.podcast. And then the list construct. Okay, and then I'm going to shorten these two. Okay, so this is obviously still going to fail because I don't have this podcast here. So, but if I were to create this, right? So now I create podcasts, and so this here will pass, and I'll end up moving on to these next few lines here, right? So let's just run this and get this. So we get this here. So not everything in this is a podcast because, well, it's empty. Now we could argue that should pass. Because we're never going to actually have it empty. So I don't think we have to worry about like creating that kind of case for it. So let's come in here and then say let's create this podcast object. So in here we need to import from podcast data, import podcast data. So podcast data, and it's going to take a dictionary, right? So we could give it a none, I guess. Let's see if that works. Probably not for the podcast in data. I think it's gonna not work because I think we used the copy, right? We didn't actually. We should do a copy in here. Save that and run everything. All right. Yeah. So see, it has no type copy, but we could do an empty dictionary. But now this is where we're gonna hit the validation error. Right. So see how when we in this podcast validate, we get this error because it needs to be an actual podcast for it to do something. So in that case, if we're just going to add in the podcast here, and now we run it, we get false is not true. And is that, oh, that's because we're returning the wrong type. Is that not because we were doing that? Podcast data. And then that needs to be closed there. So just kind of bugs and everything we're doing. Close this and close that. Okay, great. And everything passes. So just some of the quick updates that I just kind of made there. So obviously I wasn't returning this, it was returning none instead. And so that's obviously not true. So that actually might, let's see if that actually reduces this case. So let's just remove this for a second and then just sit and run it. Okay, so see, yeah, so now it does pass like it should because there's nothing in it. So this all is true, but there's not 17. So now we have to actually add back in this. And then if we were giving it the empty dictionary as we did before, and we do that, again, see it fails on that assert. So we come back and we add in this dictionary here, and now everything works. So it runs through the assert, and so we have this is the code, and so let's see what we have open. So what do? We updated this. I think it's just with the validate and the copy. Let's check this. Git diff. So the podcast data, we added the copy, as well as the validate. And I have been on the second screen that entire time, haven't I? That's great. All right, so I guess what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut out that last portion and then can't like re-record it. All right, so I'm just gonna end. What should I do? Should I? Well, okay, so I'll cut out that last portion. Okay. So I was on the wrong screen the entire time I was doing this, so I'm just going to go back and explain everything that I kind of made as updates. So let me commit this. And RSS feed or validate. Reader to hold podcasts. All right. So this is basically what I was just working on there. And okay, so everything that I was doing, I was on the wrong screen. So now I'm just gonna have to go ahead and explain it all. So basically what we have here is the git log one line -5. So, okay, just to kind of go back real quick. So let's go git checkout. So now we jumped back into this one here where we created this empty one. So this is what we did. So we ended up adding the all in this way. So we created this method isURLs, which checks that any URL that's given has this format. So when we loop through the URLs, and we grab a URL, we just run it through this method, and we basically get a true or false value. And then we have the all that says that everything is true, and then gives us if every single one of these values that gets run through this method returns true, aka if every single one of these URLs has this in it, then this assert true holds. So we added that portion in there, and then in this case, so we have the dictionary and returning the URL directly. So now let's go forward one more. And so now we added the test retrieve data and the RC feed constructor in. Is that the one I was just on? Okay, so let's go to this one. Git checkout. Okay, so here we added in this podcast data struct. So essentially, instead of having single methods like for all this, we took this podcast data, putting in here, and we're doing this validate, which we're validating that everything is a name, a URL, and a type. And so this is where we I need to use git checkout here. Okay, so here, so the final part of this podcast data, basically, we're giving you a dictionary, we're creating a copy of it and saving it, and then we're validating that in here we have a name, a URL, and a type, right? So whenever we create one of these, we copy it in, and then we validate that it has these three keys with values in them. So then in this, what we do here is when we read in this data, so here we have a list of dictionaries, and we essentially save it. We loop through this list, we have these dictionaries, and we save it in a very thin kind of API for the podcast data, which still, so if I have a podcast in here, I'm still going to be able to operate on it by saying, so if I have this podcast, right, and so it's a list of them, so if I take one of them, inside here, it actually just contains this deep podcast. So I'm just wrapping it, and the reason I'm wrapping it is to basically just do the validation. So yes, it kind of takes a little more to get into, but right, if I were to like have this in kind of a loop, right, I could say for data in here, and then data.podcast, and then here I'm able to access all the elements, as opposed to being able to say here, right, like name, and then accessing it directly if it's that. I just get this extra level of validation in there so I can assume it's all correct. What I have here then to actually do the test is, so when I'm testing it, creating the RSS feeder, and then, so in the creation of the RSS feeder, it reads in all this podcast data. So I assert that it has this podcast as a list. I then have this method that helps me take a podcast and validate that its type is this podcast data structure that I have. And then so I can use that same sort of list construct to loop through all the podcasts in the list, and then basically get a true or false value of the type is equal to this. And then if all of them are true, so if all of the types of the data that of each element that's in this list is podcast data, this is true, and then I'm verifying that there are 17 of them. And so then, right, as I did before, if I'm running this, I get this verify that it's true. And I think I removed. I'm just going to add this extra line back for now. So I have a clean. So I got my head detached. So because I was going through that, so let me one line. And so I'm going to go get Q, get checkout, and I'm just going to check that branch out. So now I no longer have a detached head because I'm no longer just on this commit. I'm actually on the branch itself. So, all right, that's all kind of set up there. We've added in the data class, and we have so we've added in the data class to kind of hold this RSS stuff, and we now have access through the RSS reader. So now we'll be able to do an actual retrieval. Now, to do the kind of the testing of that, we're going to want to basically be able to kind of mock it. And so that actually is a good use case for creating something that will do the fetch, because then in the test scenario, we won't have to, we don't want to make a call to the actual like feed. So we will probably end up we will actually abstract out another class where we're going to basically create a class for everything, but they're going to be very simple, simple classes. And the reason for it is, again, just, in fact, I mean, I guess we don't have to. We could import a different test get. So next time we'll start adding in this requests portion. Sorry that this whole thing was a little bit all over the place because I kind of didn't get the screens right, but I guess that's what kind of happens when you are doing this for only the fourth time. So at least we kind of got some of the structure going and stuff, and while it was a little hectic going forward, we'll have a little better way to kind of work through all this and add in kind of more code and get different stuff working. So with that, that'll be all for this time. So see you.